Hello, and welcome to Danny B, Journalism's the fuck out of shit. Now, for our maiden episode, first of all, a bit of an explanation about the show. In my travels, I've come across many interesting, vibrant, and intelligent people who have informed my opinion massively, and for today we have one of those people, a dear friend of mine that I've known for several years, that is now an intelligence specialist in the New Zealand Police. We won't be giving away his name for legal purposes, but he's free to give his own personal opinions on things. So.
What an introduction.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And it's great to be here, and I'm honoured to be part of the maiden podcast, I suppose.
Yeah. We're pleased to have you here. So we'll call you Mr. C for some reason. I
like that.
I just chose C.
It works.
So tell us about what you do now, how you got there.
Sure. Okay, so essentially what I'm doing now is I'm in an intelligence role with the New Zealand Police. I started out taking volume crime calls, which is essentially still part of my job now, and I've been with the police now for over 2 years.
Yep.
And yeah.
So how did you get there? How was your journey after, say, you left high school?
Yeah, sure. So when I left high school, I went straight to uni, as everyone does.
Yeah.
Studied politics, history, and law.
Yep.
And upon returning, I picked up a labour job, sort of stuck around there, figuring out what I wanted to do. And then I decided I wanted to become a police officer, actually, but I haven't got what it takes to pass the physical requirements.
All right.
So I decided I would pick up an intel job, yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
That's why we don't use a camera in these recordings.
And I appreciate that.
Okay, so what kind of career trajectory does that give you? Where are you heading towards at the moment?
It's hard to tell because with police, you feel you're moving sideways rather than up more often than not. So
across.
Yeah. So, I mean, from where I started, I don't think technically I'm further ahead, if you know what I mean.
Okay.
I mean, I guess where I'm heading at the very best, perhaps maybe an intel manager of some kind of description.
Okay, well,
Yeah.
this ties into a direction of questioning I wanted to go into that our audience has provided. What's the social side of the police like? Is it a brotherhood? Does it feel like being part of an army or an organisation?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I guess I wouldn't know what it's like to be in an army as such, but from what I've experienced, I haven't found another, I suppose, feeling of society where I was in high school and university, when I was working in the labour industry, any other place I've been. It does feel like a brotherhood of sorts.
Yeah.
I mean, of course, sisterhood, brotherhood.
Yeah.
2018.
Yeah.
But yeah, it does definitely feel like that. The police, like when you're with them, they've got your back. But if you sort of bring them into disrepute, they kind of turn on you quite quickly.
Okay, so
Yeah.
it's definitely like an in-group
Not from
mentality.
yeah, of course, yeah. And you do feel as though you're part of something, and I suppose it comes from actually seeing the difference you're making.
Yeah.
And I guess you feel as though you're part of like a well-established organisation rather than a fledgling company, perhaps.
Do you feel as if like the emotional strain of the job makes it more of a brotherhood as well? The fact that you are dealing with such intense things.
For sure. So I mean, I guess if, let's say for example, the two of us, we've both been through some pretty hellish stuff. I mean, you're going to feel closer to that person than you would to your friend from high school that you did math with.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
I don't know how it works with police officers. I assume it's the same. They're both going, if you're paired up with someone, you're both going to some pretty terrible things and you go through some pretty hard times. You do feel closer. So that does help the brotherhood, I suppose, yeah.
Okay. Now we move into some personal opinion type things, because I understand your constraints about talking about such things. But are there police officers that the rest of the police community don't like or don't approve of? For professional or personal reasons?
Yeah, sure. So I guess with any organisation, police is possibly the largest organisation in New Zealand in terms of how many employees.
Possibly.
There's going to be some sort of bad apples, I suppose. I mean, in my sort of context, yeah, sure, there's people that shouldn't be working for police, absolutely. There's people that it's more the sort of I suppose the older generation of police employee that perhaps before we were so liberal, I suppose, and valued of diversity and things like that. Perhaps they're the ones that have might have more issues.
Okay, so is that down to their personal beliefs?
I'd say so.
Okay, so it's not actually the way they do the job so much as it is them as a person.
Yeah, I mean, perhaps a reluctance to change.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'd say that was the problem.
Well, since you touched on that, how has do you believe that these new this new social movement towards equality and understanding and such has made police officers' jobs harder?
So I'd say it absolutely does, because now every interaction a police officer has with someone, they have to think about how that interaction is going to be responded if it does reach the media. So in terms of, let's say they're dealing with a young Māori person, if it goes to hell and that goes to the media, how they interact with that person, it's dictated by these new cultural norms that we have. And it's not necessarily a bad thing, but it is absolutely something that makes their job harder, in my opinion.
Do you believe it makes it more dangerous? Because we have seen an upsurge of violent crime towards police officers in New Zealand with firearms, which is a new trend, and we'll touch on it later. But do you think it makes it more dangerous to do the job if you're worried about a media impact?
I believe it will do. I don't think it weighs as heavily as people may think.
This is not America, yeah.
Yeah, of course. But, I mean, every single time an officer... I mean, this is my opinion, because, of course, I'm not a police officer.
You're not...
But every time an officer deals... Well, every time they go and speak with someone, that's in the back of their mind how they're going to respond. Do they have a gun? But in terms of the cultural... with firearms, I guess there is no real correlation at this stage that I can see.
Okay. So before we go off too far in that direction, how do cultural understandings affect your job in terms of the intelligence picture that you'll build on different people based on their ethnic groups, say like Pākehā versus Māori versus Asian? How does that kind of play out?
For me, essentially, as an intel sort of worker, it's purely for stats.
Okay.
So it doesn't affect how I conduct my job, but it may affect how someone else down the line uses my information to conduct theirs.
Okay.
So it is every contact we make. It is it's a category that needs to be filled. So ethnicity, of course, is part of that. But in terms of how I deal with people, it isn't something that makes much difference.
Okay.
Yeah.
In your experiences, have you come across any corruption within the New Zealand police of any variety? And if so, could you talk about it as much as you could?
Yeah. So I don't think that the New Zealand police is as corrupt as people would like to believe. Like, we're told New Zealand has one of the least corrupt police forces in the world.
Yep.
And I believe in that.
Yeah.
I think the corruption comes from how particular stats are used. So, for example, domestic violence. We're hearing now that there's an incredible increase in domestic violence.
Yeah.
Whereas it's in my opinion that it's a increase in reported domestic violence.
Okay.
I don't think that it's increasing. And I think that it's a political tool, and as a result, perhaps could be considered corrupt. And in terms of how funding's allocated, that's where I feel the corruption may be coming from.
Okay, so is that a political agenda, or is that people pushing their own personal interest by getting further funding?
I think it's a bit of both, to be honest with you. It sort of depends on the flavour of the day in terms of government.
Okay, so while we're here, how has that changed your job?
Recently, with the change? Okay, so, I mean, the obvious change is that we're employing an incredible amount of people at the moment. In the last few weeks, we've employed 30 communicators, I think it was.
Okay.
And that's sort of predicted to increase, and that's as a result...
What's a communicator? Sorry.
So a communicator, it's sort of the base police employee, non-sworn, so they're not an officer necessarily, but they sort of enter in and they start taking either intel notings or... volume crime reports. So those are historic offences, burglaries, theft from vehicles, stolen cars, things like that.
Okay.
Yeah. So I guess that's in terms of corruption. Well, yeah, I mean, it's hard for me to tell.
I mean, we're shifting in a different direction here, but I think it's interesting that are political agendas pushed onto the police? And how does that affect what you do?
So it's hard for me to tell at this stage because we're relatively new into this new government that we've got at the moment. I've only been a police employee really with a national government. So with Labour, they're making promises to reduce imprisonment.
Okay.
And also to reduce the amount of Māori offending.
Okay.
I mean, how they're planning on doing that, it's not clear to me at this stage.
Yeah. Well, as an intelligence specialist, what would you say to that? Because you're dealing with facts and figures and numbers,
well,
right?
Of course, my biggest concern is that in order to meet those goals, we'll be letting people off with lighter sort of sentences. But of course, that falls outside of the realm of policing and into the realm of the sort of judicial sector of our society.
It's the courts. Well, to keep it moving, I do want to touch on that a bit because it's something that I don't think a lot of people understand is the interplay between the police system and the courts and how they're not always friends. So could you...
I'd say my experience so far, it's been relatively hostile when it comes to how we deal with the judicial system.
Okay.
Primarily because we don't agree with sentencing. Well, I don't.
Okay. Give me an example.
For example, with how we sentence youth. It's tricky, of course, because the people I'm dealing with are particularly frustrated because they have children committing high-level offences, robberies, things, even armed assaults.
Violent crime.
They're back on the streets the next day or the next week, and with those same people being dealt with by a weak youth sort of judicial system, in my opinion. So
the police can go as hard as they want and arrest these people all they want, but if the courts don't do anything, then...
Well, that's right, yeah. For example, I think it was perhaps before Christmas, we had an incident where a youth had stolen a vehicle. Relatively well-known story. He led police on a pursuit, relatively short pursuit, wrong way on the southern motorway. We ended up catching up with him, and as far as the public were concerned, that's the last they heard of him until... I think it was a week later where he was involved in another pursuit, another stolen car, and he crashed and he died.
Okay. Wow. Well, as tragic as that is the fault of that? You spoke about a weak youth justice system. Is that legislation? Is that a problem with not having enough beds to put people in? Is that a problem with the judges themselves? Like, what do you view the problem?
My opinion, it's a view shared by most New Zealanders, is that we can't be too hard on the youth at the moment. And that by punishing them, we're going to create worse adults. Which in some circumstances is the case. But I think we've gone too far in the other direction.
So we've, as you said before, we've got people who are 15 that are comfortable with violent crime.
That's right.
Comfortable with committing serious offences and have never faced consequences.
And it might sound, well, overused to say, but if they think that they're going to be back on the streets the next day, then what's the sort of what's the deterrent?
There isn't one.
There isn't one.
And what's the solution?
That's right. Well, in that case, he ended up killing himself.
Well, since you did decide to take it to such a dark place, thank you for that. No, it's good. This is what it's about. It's about getting real about the difficulties that this country are facing, and answering people's questions. So, could you talk about something personally that you've experienced that was tough even for you to deal with, and how that affected you? And if you could just maybe give us...
Sure, yeah. So I suppose it was earlier on in my time with police, and we get, we're sort of realising now that quite a few people with mental conditions use police as their outlet rather than so mental health lines and things like that. So I had a person call through, unwilling to provide their location where they were. And it became apparent quite quickly that something was wrong. They were sounding as though they were incoherent, perhaps injured, and eventually they told me that they had cut a gas line in their kitchen, and gas was filling the room, and they were unwilling to turn the gas off, and they just wanted to have someone with them while they were dying.
Wow. And they decided to put that on you, just doing your job.
Unfortunately, yeah. I mean, when you're in that moment, I suppose that sort of thing doesn't cross your mind. But that person wouldn't be thinking how it's going to affect the person taking the call. We didn't know where they were, and we were unable to get to them in time to... to stop what they were trying to do.
So what does that tell you about, I mean, because you're a real person, you're not just a statistician and an intel officer, what does that tell you about the state of mental health in New Zealand, in your opinion?
Mental health is a real problem for police because we can't just take someone that's suffering from a mental health condition and put them in prison, of course. I mean, that also means that we're limited to how we can help that person. If the person refuses help, that makes it tricky as well. There's no family. Homeless people, quite a few of them are suffering from some sort of mental condition.
Yep.
And, I mean, it's a problem for us because we can't just lock them away. We can remove them from the situation, but in terms, it's similar to our problem with the youth. They're just back out there the next day because if they aren't in the capacity to care about themselves and they haven't got anyone else that cares about themselves, the state's expected to do that, and we don't do that well.
And the state doesn't have the services.
No. So, well, I wouldn't go that far. I mean, the services exist, but they're hard to access, in my opinion.
Do you think part of the problem, because I've just thought this as I've listened to you, is a lack of interplay between governmental services? Like a lack of cooperation between the police, the courts, and...
Well, some, perhaps. I mean, we've got a pretty good relationship with NZTA.
Okay.
The Traffic Association.
But they're not dealing with mental health, are
well,
they?
yeah, exactly. I mean, and there is no real mental health department. You know what I mean? Like, we've got the district health boards, and how
do you deal with it? You know, how do you deal with a problem that's not visible?
Yeah, well, exactly. I mean, given my role, it's much more difficult because I'm not dealing with someone face to face.
How does that affect your intel picture that you build, though? Like, if you were trying to provide intelligence on someone that was a serious criminal but did have mental health problems, how does that affect the information you hand on to officers?
There is an aspect, I suppose, where police, of course, aren't medically trained experts. And I suppose in terms of the intel side of things, we've only got previous incidences to go by. So if someone's having a mental breakdown, we will get a specialist in most circumstances. If that specialist says the person's suffering from a certain condition, we may make a log of that. That would be as far as, I suppose, the information that we're able to sort of collect.
But I understand you're not a frontline police officer, but do you think it would affect the way that they interact with people? Say they have been informed that this person does have a history of mental illness. Yeah. Is it massively going to affect the way they do their job?
Yeah, of course, because if the person is showing as being particularly aggressive, then that's going to sort of dictate how that officer deals with them. If we send one police officer or three, based on whether or not that person has known to have some sort of mental condition and potentially be in possession of firearms. Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Okay. Well, to our lovely audience listener that wanted questions on mental health answered, I hope you got your answers there. Now, to talk a little bit more about your job, you're building intelligence pictures on criminals and criminal organisations within New Zealand, among other things, correct? What trends do you see emerging in New Zealand that are new?
The trends that I've noticed, because of course I've only been relatively short time, 3-ish years. The trend I'm noticing more often is a change in drug culture, I suppose. So we're moving from cannabis and sort of party pill based kinds of drugs to more the synthetics are coming in, more prevalent than people think. Meth. So for the main change I can see are drug-related offences becoming much more serious. Firearms, I guess, I'm not too sure what it was like before, but I'm noticing more often now more automatic weapons being found in the country. Yeah. So
and where are those coming from? In so much as you can assume.
It's hard for me to tell. Yeah. I mean, do you know?
Nah. Well, 3 News doesn't know either.
Yeah.
If I get an answer, I'll get back to you.
Some have been manufactured in the country. Homemade weapons.
Yeah. So, in so much as you can, and if our audience bears in mind that this is personal opinion, informed opinion, but opinion all the same, could you categorise, in so much as you can, New Zealand's criminal organisations, what concerns you about them, what makes you not worry about them, and just kind of expanding on trends and these kind of things?
Yeah, okay. So I guess to keep it simple and sort of concise, there are essentially 2 categories. You've got the traditional gangs, so you've got mongrel mob, black power, things like that, ones that people are relatively aware of. Then we have the more, I suppose, the newer type of gangs, which are the youth gangs, and perhaps the Asian sort of gangs, things like that, organised crime. So
3 distinct categories, really.
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess it would be. I don't know a lot about Asian organised crime. It is less frequent, but probably more frequent than people think. In terms of traditional gangs, it's, I mean, for the most part, the gangs themselves are trying to move away from committing offences. Like gangs like the Mongrel Mob, for the most part, realise that they're undergoing a cultural change themselves. So I wouldn't be able to comment on that because I am not a member of the Mongrel Mob. For the record.
For now.
For now. The youth gangs are more unpredictable. They're in my opinion, they would be a greater concern to a frontline police officer. Just speaking off the cuff, they're wanting to prove themselves. And I suppose, as we mentioned earlier, some of them are underage. And therefore affected less by penalties if they are caught.
So would you think that it's fair to say that the reason that the traditional gangs don't pose as much of a threat as people think they would is because they're quite predictable?
Potentially. I mean, they are still a threat.
Of course.
It's not.
These are bad motherfuckers. It's not.
Some of them are. I mean, some of them sort of they're just there for the club mentality, I guess, which you could say. I could be criticised about joining the police for the same reason. But I mean, in terms of their danger, their crime can be considered less frequent, but more serious. When they do commit something, you've generally pissed one of them off. If that happens,
it is pretty serious. Okay. So why would, say, like new Asian gangs pose a serious threat?
I'd say it's because the finance and their connections. What I've found is that, generally speaking, they do have more connections globally. For whichever Asian country they're from. And in terms of their finances, they are better equipped.
So that does tie into another line of questioning that someone has given to me. How much do police in New Zealand, as much as you can answer this, interact with other police? In regards to, like, say, specifically what you were just talking about.
In my experience, not very much. Okay, so, I mean, I haven't dealt with instances where we've had to follow up much with overseas organisations. There certainly is a relationship there, but from what I can tell, it isn't as sort of fleshed out as people may think.
And would you view that as a problem?
In some circumstances, it would be. I think, well, the sort of ways different countries deal with their criminals or the information they have, it's not necessarily always a hindrance. That we arrive at the same conclusions, and sometimes it's easier that way, and it's not tainted by other people's information. But of course, in some circumstances, there is a relationship, if there has to be, I guess, is the answer to that one.
So in your 3 years in the police, would you say that New Zealand is becoming more international in terms of the crime being committed? I mean, there's been a lot of big news stories about this kind of stuff. Do the police see it that way?
Well, I'm not too sure what the sort of overall feel for it is, but my feel is that it's moving slower than people may think.
Okay.
You know, so people, I guess there's an assumption that we're tied up in this international growing crime sort of rate, where it's not necessarily the case. It is increasing. There are more cases of cross country crime, but I feel as though the issues pertaining to New Zealand more of domestic violence, youth abuse, things like that.
Things that have been here for a long time.
Yeah, and things that don't appear to be going anywhere anytime soon.
Okay, and now for some of your personal opinions on wider issues. What's your belief on arming the New Zealand police, and why?
I think it's a natural progression, and it will happen inevitably, and it's my opinion that that's a good thing.
Why?
As we discussed earlier, access to firearms in New Zealand is becoming easier. So if the gangs are arming themselves, I think we should probably be suited to dealing with that situation as well.
Okay. Yeah. If you were a betting man, what kind of time frame would you bet on?
I don't think it'll happen with this government. Okay. So they're looking at being in for the next at least 2 terms. So perhaps after that.
Okay.
But I mean, it's hard to tell. We're only one incident away from it happening, in my opinion, a big incident. And that they'll be armed. Australia's done it. I'm not too sure about Canada.
I'm not sure either.
Not sure, but I think there's only one more one more straw will break the camel's back.
Which ties into the next question. Do you think terrorism could ever really be a threat in New Zealand?
I think terrorism is a threat in New Zealand.
Yeah.
There's no particular examples that I have. It's sort of above my pay grade. But I mean, we've heard stories recently of people that have been caught in New Zealand trying to join ISIS.
Yeah.
And with the sort of nature of the internet at the moment, I mean, it's the sharing of information is easier than it ever has been. So it's an issue.
Would you say it's an issue, or would you say it's an inevitability?
At this stage, I'd say it's an issue.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, fair enough. What's your opinion on, because you did talk about how drug culture has changed within New Zealand. What's your opinion on the use of drugs, drug legalization, and how, just a bit
I know when it comes to drugs, I mean, there is an issue with marijuana, right? So you hear someone's using cannabis, it's illegal, but it's relatively low offending. My opinion is we're wanting to become smoke free, right? By 2020, something like that. So like introducing another smoke substance, it doesn't make much sense to me, you know what I mean? Yeah. But I mean, drug reform in terms of cannabis and things like that, I think it is happening. More serious drugs, I mean, there needs to be limits on what you can and can't put into your body. I mean, people are going to disagree with that.
But say you look at places like Portugal, and I know this is such an atypical line of questioning, but if you look at places like Portugal that have made moves about legalising even serious drugs, and it's massively affected the criminal culture there, what do you think about that?
I just don't think we have a culture like that in this country.
We couldn't absorb it?
I don't think we could.
Okay.
For the sort of like immediate time frame, I mean, it would just, in my opinion, the sort of people that we have in this country just wouldn't respond quite too well to a legalization of serious drugs.
So you spoke to us a little bit in the green room about how people that want to join the police need to stop watching CSI and these TV shows because it doesn't reflect the reality. What surprised you the most about your time with the police?
Honestly, that we can't track phones.
What?
Yeah.
You heard it here first, folks.
Well, we're limited to how we can track phones. It's essentially we're governed by the same laws as everyone else in the country. There's a privacy law that stops us from doing that.
Yeah.
And Spark and Vodafone Telecom, well, formerly Telecom, they're not necessarily willing to give us that ability because, of course, it damages their customer base.
Okay.
We can, in serious circumstances, perhaps, but it's not something that's widely available to police.
Okay.
And I'm talking more along the lines of, my phone's been stolen, can you track it?
Yeah.
No.
Okay, well, if they can't do that, they're not tracking ISIS either, are they?
Well.
Well, I think that might wrap it up.
I mean, it's been great talking to you, but I mean, depending on how this interview goes, could potentially be looking for a new job. So if there's anyone out there in the distant future that's got an application going, I've got a BA, which sort of gets me ready for Burger King and McDonald's. But we could potentially have a much more interesting interview in the future if that does happen.
I'd hope so.
I don't. I quite enjoy my job.
All right, well, thank you, Mr. C. And if we get great feedback, maybe there'll be a round two.
Not a problem. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.